South Korea has a serious housing fraud problem that will lead to an estimated 1.85 trillion Korean won, or around 1.4 billion US dollars, in fraud damages alone in the year 2023. And all of these housing fraud cases in Korea have its roots on a housing rental system that is very much unique to South Korea, called the Jeonse system. With the Jeonse system, tenants pay a lump sum deposit to the landlord instead of the usual monthly rent, and at the end of the lease period, the landlord is legally required to pay back the deposit to the tenant in full. So first, how did the Jeonse system find its roots in the nation's housing market and become so popular in South Korea? As I've mentioned in one of our previous videos on our channel that discusses how all things in South Korea are currently being way too much centralized in its capital city of Seoul to dangerous levels. A lot of the current problems that exist in Korea have its links with the Korean historical tendency of Seoul centralization. And with the creation of the Jeonse system that cannot be wholly attributed to Seoul centralization, the roots of the system is indeed at least partly linked. To elaborate, in the late 19th century, the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1876 was signed. And with the signing of the treaty, three major ports of Korea, namely the Busan Port, the Incheon Port, and the Wonsan Port, were made open to trade, contributing to more people who used to live in the countryside areas of South Korea to move to the capital city of Seoul due to the increased availability of jobs in the area. And the Jeonse system was a convenient way for many people who moved from the countryside regions of Korea to the capital city to find a place to live. A lot of these people who newly moved to Seoul had a bit of savings in their hands, such as from selling the farm in which they previously had before moving to Seoul. However, what they did not have yet was a place to live in Seoul as well as a job. So this type of Jeonse system organically sprouted in South Korea, where the tenant paid a lump sum payment, which were usually the savings that they brought with them at the time, to the landlord, and in return, the landlord provided the tenant with a place to stay. And it is really interesting how in the 21st century, with the advancement of the modern financial system, this Jeonse system is still very much continuing in South Korea. On the surface aspect of things, the Jeonse system can seem like a win-win for both the tenant and the landlord. For the tenant, the Jeonse system can be a good way in the sense that you get to effectively live in a house rent-free, as the lump sum deposit is to be fully refunded to you at the end of the lease period. For the landlord, the Jeonse system can be also beneficial for the fact that the landlord gets to receive a large lump sum capital in which they can spend at their will. They can put it in the bank and receive interest, or they can invest in the stock market, or if they run a business, then they can invest the finances into their existing business, so on and so forth. But if this housing system was all good with no bad, then it should have been adopted in many other countries around the globe, and not just in South Korea. So, for instance, why wasn't a system similar to the Jeonse system adopted in the US? I believe the answer provided by Jason Popovich, a real estate agent based in the US, pretty much sums it up.
I didn't know about it in the past, and it's only recently I learned about it. I think the challenge here is that if you were trying to do something in a system here in the US or in America, I think the first hurdle to overcome is trust. I think giving a large sum of money to someone you don't know is a very challenging concept for most Americans.
And there you have it. The prominent reason as to why a system similar to the Jeonse system in South Korea does not exist in other countries is mainly due to issues of trust. By giving a large lump sum deposit to an individual whom you essentially know nothing about, "They don't know me, son!" you run the risk of the landlord not being able to pay back the deposit to you at the end of the lease, stating that they no longer have the money. Or even worse, the landlord could just disappear with the money, which does indeed occur quite frequently in South Korea. And in fact, South Korea is in a state of a ticking time bomb when it comes to many of the Jeonse lease-based tenants not being able to receive their lump sum deposits back from the landlords. Many frauds who take advantage of the Jeonse system of South Korea conduct their criminal activity based on what people often describe in South Korea as quote-unquote gap investing. What this is that these quote-unquote gap investing individuals find the tenants who are willing to rent a house through the Jeonse method before they even legally buy a house and have technically become the landlord. And once they find this tenant who are willing to pay the large lump sum deposit to rent the house through the Jeonse method, the gap investors first receive the large lump sum payment from the potential tenant, then use this money to buy a house and become a quote-unquote landlord. And if they cannot buy the house with just the lump sum deposit from the tenant alone, they borrow a bit from the bank or other institutions or entities to cover the rest of the buying costs. What this effectively does is allow these criminals to buy a house and become landlords with almost no money spent from their own end and rent them out through the Jeonse method. And through this strategy, they repeat the process over and over, and purchased many houses across South Korea. Now, if housing prices continue to go up, then this quote-unquote gap investment is successful. The quote-unquote landlord who bought the house with almost no money in the first place by manipulating the Jeonse system can repay the tenant of the lump sum deposit at the end of the lease period, primarily from the financial gains in which they have made from the increase in their house valuation that was made over the past 2 years, which is the normal length of a Jeonse lease. Again, for a person who initially bought the house and turned himself into a landlord with almost no money of their own in the first place, this is not bad at all. But unfortunately, housing prices do not always go up. So what happens when housing prices begin to drop, as in the current economic atmosphere, with rising interest rates and mostly contraction in monetary policies conducted around the world, including South Korea? Then all hell breaks loose. When the 2-year Jeonse lease period ends and the quote-unquote landlord has to pay the deposit back to the tenant, these landlords who bought and rented the house out to the tenant do not have the lump sum deposit to pay back to the tenant anymore, as the appreciation of housing prices over the past 2 years is nowhere near enough to cover for the existing large lump sum payment that is due back to the tenant. Now, if these landlords who bought the houses through manipulating the Jeonse rental system is a legitimate full-on fraud, then they often just run away with the money, cutting off all contacts with the tenant. But let's say the quote-unquote gap investing landlord was just a greedy investor who thought that housing prices will continue to go upwards forever, but is not criminal enough to just disappear and run away with the tenant's deposit, which more than often are the literal life savings of decades of hard work of the tenant. Then they inform the tenant that they no longer have the tenant's deposit and will not be able to pay them back at the end of the lease period. Then under the South Korean housing law, this house goes over to be auctioned in order to seek a new buyer for the house. But as I stated earlier, if housing prices went down in the last 2 years, this means that the bid price for the house will be significantly lower than what the house was bought for 2 years ago. And to add to that, the debt in which the fraud landlord made to the bank to finance partly for the house legally comes first to be fully refunded before repaying any deposit owed to the tenant. So after the debt owed to the bank is repaid, then the tenant can finally receive a bit of the Jeonse deposit back. But then it is almost certain that in this case, the tenant will never be able to receive the Jeonse lump sum deposit back in full, not to even mention all the time wasted and mental torture of first receiving the message from the fraud landlord informing the tenant that they cannot pay the tenant's Jeonse deposit back, when again, with sky-high housing prices of South Korea right now, the lump sum deposits of the tenants are almost often cases the literal life savings of the tenants. Then the tenant has to wait for months or even years for a new buyer to bid for the house through the auctioning process and have the lump sum deposit finally at least partly compensated through the payment made by the new buyer of the house. Another method in which fraudulent characters in South Korea enjoy using to take advantage of Korea's Jeonse system and manipulate it for their own financial gain is through a method called a trustee fraud. Let's say that an individual wants to build a small building of around 4 stories tall that can house around 8 households. But one individual, most often case, does not have all the financing necessary to build such a building. So what they do is that they give the ownership rights of this to-be-built building to a trustee company in order to have the trustee company borrow the financing necessary to build the building from the bank. Then through this financial capital which was granted from the bank through the trustee company, the individual can then build the desired small building. And obviously throughout this whole process, the individual and the trustee company are legally obliged to sign a contract between them which states that the individual who is now the owner and landlord of the building by name is legally required to first receive the agreement from the trustee company when the landlord is to admit any new tenant into the building. This is, after all, it was the financial capital from the trustee company which allowed this apartment to be built in the first place and not the capital from the individual landlord. So in that sense, the trustee company is the real owner of the apartment and not the quote-unquote landlord who is only the owner of the apartment building by name. However, what some fraud quote-unquote landlords do is that once they build a building through this method, they then find tenants who are willing to rent a room in the building through the Jeonse method. Then the landlord receives large lump sum deposits from the to-be tenant without notifying the trustee company. Then these Jeonse contracts that were signed between the landlord and the new tenants are not legally binding, as it does not have necessary consent from the trustee company that is required under law. And the colossal problem related to this is that, as this contract between the landlord and the new tenant is not legally binding, the tenant is not protected under the Korean Housing Lease Protection Act. And in the worst case scenario, these fraudulent landlords who sign these legally not binding contracts with multiple tenants and receive large Jeonse deposits from them disappear with all of the collected deposit. In the year 2023, an estimated 1.85 trillion Korean won, or around 1.4 billion US dollars, will be lost from the hands of the innocent civilians of South Korea through the Jeonse fraud. And these are numbers based on fraud cases clearly identified by the South Korean government, so you can imagine that the people who will be victims of the Jeonse fraud in Korea will be much larger than the officially estimated numbers. And when we just say $1.4 billion, it may just sound like a number. But all of this is money that are most often the life savings of decades of toil of ordinary South Koreans, only to have it all taken away from them and be left with nothing. And some may ask, if the Jeonse rental system is so problematic, why not just get rid of it and just have the system not exist as the case of all other nations? Well, the answer is not that simple. With the contractionary economic atmosphere that's prevailing around the globe, including South Korea right now, many landlords at this very moment do not have the Jeonse lump sum deposit to pay back to the tenants. So if the government is to announce the abolishment of the Jeonse rental system in Korea, then many landlords would have to declare that they do not have the finances required to pay the lump sum deposit back to the tenants, meaning that the houses will then have to be auctioned, which means a flood of new houses being sold in the South Korean housing market. And as we all know, when there is a sudden increase in supply, prices drop rapidly, meaning that the Korean housing market will likely crash with a rapid downfall in housing prices. So all in all, the unfortunate and twisted reality of South Korea right now is that the Jeonse system is not something that the South Korean authorities can just get rid of at the moment, despite the large number of fraud cases created by the unique system and the reports of victims of the system that are reported on the South Korean news on a daily basis.